Hello, Outfesters, and thank you so much for joining us at the Q&A for the Capote Tapes. I know you enjoyed the film, and I know you're ready to hear more from the director, Yves Berneau, who I am joined with here from right outside of London. Yves, how's it going?
Going great. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Quick introduction for me. My name's Daniel Crook. I'm the programming coordinator here at Outfest, and my pronouns are he, him, his. And I am really thrilled to be here with you, Yves. I have to tell you, I saw the film, I think for the first time back in March. In Cold Blood made quite an impression on me as a high schooler. So Capote is someone who is near and dear to my heart. And I didn't think that there was that much more to know about him. I thought I knew everything. And then here I watch your film, and I'm seeing him in a whole new light in ways that I never perceived. So I'm curious for you. Uh, why Capote for you? This is your first film. What was it about Truman that was so compelling to you that you wanted to make your feature debut with a film about him?
Gosh, great question. So honestly, it's kind of what you just said. I thought I grew up reading Capote. I loved Breakfast, and I loved In Cold Blood, and the short stories, Miriam, and all of those. And I thought I knew a lot about Truman. And I was reading a book, actually, a big biography called In All His Glory, which was about the founder of CBS, Bill Paley. And by the time I finished the book, I was far more interested in Truman and Babe than I was in anything about Bill. And so as I started doing more research and reading and really focusing in on Truman's life, and I'd seen the two films, the two feature films that had come out, I was most moved by realizing that this was in some ways an unsung hero. And it was a person who had a lot more of a life story to tell. And it just spoke to me at that moment, and, became a passion project.
I was going to ask this later, but since you touched on the two fiction films quickly, Capote and Infamous, I feel like those films have sort of defined the lens through which we look at Capote now. If you were to take one piece of work and evaluate who he was, we tend to think of In Cold Blood. What I thought was so fascinating about your film is instead you focus on answered prayers as sort of this lens into who the man was and what his work was about. So I just have to ask, what was it about answered prayers specifically that for you was the crux for the whole thing, or the lens through which to view Capote's life and work?
I think In Cold Blood has so been done. And actually, I think, and it was a big, obviously, chunk of his life. But for me, answered prayers is so unknown, and so unread. And actually, it was both the his downfall, but it also is an interesting lens on his life, I think, because the way that's written is something he was doing since childhood. So when he was, I think, in second grade or so, his best friend was Harper Lee. And he won a prize in a local newspaper for writing an essay called Mrs. Busybody. But it was actually about Harper Lee's mother, who would sit on her front porch and kind of was very nosy and in everyone's business. And so he did the same thing when he did his interview with Marlon Brando. And certainly Breakfast at Tiffany is really it's a slice of a number of different women in his life. And so I think it's interesting because part of what any author does, I think, any great author, is that they use elements of their life. And so I think what he was doing with Answered Prayers was really, he said it would be his Proustian work. He hoped that he could pull all of these disparate pieces of real life together and tell this really fascinating story. And so using that as a lens for me made sense because it was A, part of his literary genius for what he did. B, it was certainly the last chapter in his life. So it's an interesting lens through which to look at it. And honestly, it's just really interesting. And the people that he's talking about and the era that he paints is something that for us today is a bygone era in many ways, but it's a mix between fabulous gossip and really, really good writing.
On the gossip note there, one thing I really appreciate about the film is that you're not just engaging in literary criticism, you're not just engaging in the perspectives of everyone around him to define who he was, but you spend a lot of time on his public persona and the notion of celebrity just as much as you do the behind the scenes in compiling his various novels and short stories, etc. Time at the New Yorker. So what was it about his celebrity that you thought was so crucial in capturing, beyond just the fact that he was such a magnetic presence on talk shows and always had a good line for everything? What is it about Capote's celebrity that you think endures as a subject?
Well, I think it's multifaceted. One is certainly the fact that he was a gay man, and he and there and an out gay man. He was an openly gay man, and in an era where people were still sending notes saying that Mr. Liberace should find a nice girl, and my niece wants to meet Mr. Liberace. You know, um, I think Truman was the celebrity was in part certainly the brilliance of the writing. You just can't beat it. And then you have two phenomenal films that are created out of it. But also this idea that he was clever and witty, but he also was other, which for me was a really important part of the film. He was not by society standards at the time in the mainstream. And so therefore he was out. He was open about his conversation on Johnny Carson or Dick Cavett or any of these talk shows, and he went on regularly, and he was who he was. And that mixture of being true to himself in many ways, and being honest and open, I think allowed the American public to just kind of gloss. I don't think they even really thought about his sexuality. They just thought, oh, he's clever, but they knew he was different. And I think it's his difference that is a big part of what set him aside from Norman Mailer and many of the other authors of the day when it comes to that celebrity cachet.
Glad you brought up Norman Mailer, because I think his anecdote in the film is one of the most striking. It's one of the ones that certainly hasn't left my head, because it's almost just a great cocktail party line. But about how he goes into the bar with the 50, what does he say, like the sour masculinity in the room. He goes into the
Yes.
bar in the middle of the day and is unapologetically himself. In terms of visibility, I mean, I've always thought about Capote as an iconic gay author, but I'm not sure, and of course, an iconic gay celebrity, but just going into a bar and being himself when there are no cameras around, it takes a tremendous amount of bravery. And I appreciate your answer, because that's how I felt watching the film too, especially through the Mailer story. And actually, I think that type of anxiety of being out in public, being othered, is still incredibly relevant right now. But in terms of the period you evoke in the film, I'm curious, sort of the process behind searching for those wonderful archival videos from the 40s and 50s and beyond, as well as the music choices. How important was it for you not just to reference the era, but to evoke the era in the film?
What a great question. And I have to tell you, it's when you mentioned the music, because the music was a really I was really passionate about the music in the film. It was really important for me to evoke the era, because I look at it. I have four kids, three of which are much older, and I thought when I was doing this film for my youngest son, who was at the time 15, I really wanted something that I wanted him to understand a bygone world. I wanted him to be watching something and really step into and learn something, but be intrigued by it and sense that. So it was really important to me that you saw, the archival footage of the taxis, that we remember that New York City had that same vibrance, but it was a different look. And of course, the way people dressed. And of course, in those incredible audio tapes from George Plimpton, some of this was cut out, but you could hear, George and Lauren Bacall talking, and like the glasses clinking and the ice and the more vodka being poured. And, it was really important to evoke that. The music was critical to me. One, because it certainly drives the story. But for me as a person of color directing this film, which was very much white. There's no, it is what it is. I was adamant that the music really be representative and bring in black and a black American jazz, bring in the sounds of the era. And whether it was hearing God Bless the Child or hearing, so it was for me the only place that I could authentically try, because to your point, I was telling Truman's story, but I was also trying to give a picture of an entire era. And it's difficult to do an era where everyone looks the same. And so for me, it was really important to try and through the music, bring in a soulfulness that injected, my grandmother, into that era, who was around then, but, wasn't part of the story.
That's fascinating to me, and it's very much your role as a documentarian to tell the entire picture. You have your research materials, you have the tapes themselves, which I want to ask about in a second, but you really are painting the entire picture of the era. You are framing the era as a filmmaker, and I think you bring that to life so beautifully. About the tapes, I don't want to bury the lead here. How did you get access to those tapes? What I know you cover this in the documentary, but what exactly is the origin of those tapes? And well, I'll leave it open there. Tell me about your experience finding them and listening to them.
We had a great family friend who heard I was working on the project and said, you should talk with George Plimpton's widow, Sarah, who had done some work with him when she would also often work with him as he was interviewing, because he took a decade interviewing all of these interesting people who were living at the time. And so I got in touch with her, and she was lovely and is divine. And we had some wonderful conversations. And she said, well, I didn't even know there were tapes. She said, I think we might have some of George's tapes, like in a storage unit or in the attic or where, a different house. And they were kind of in different buckets, different, batches. And she unearthed them and said, here you go. And as I started listening, and it was cassette tapes. And one of the great things, again, is you hear George and his subjects struggling on the tapes, because you'll hear him saying, is it on? Is it on? And then you hear Slim Keith being like, I don't think it's on, darling. Get me another vodka. And, there's this wonderful backstory. And so it was really Sarah's generosity and George's incredible decade of work that allowed, and then getting them and listening to them, and there were hours upon hours upon hours, and then transcribing and really trying to thread an interesting needle.
What did you find most surprising in those tapes about Capote? You touched on this earlier, and I said that I had felt the same way. There's so much in this film. There's so many little details that I simply didn't know about the man, even though we think we know everything about him. What for you was the most surprising in your research?
Great question. The most surprising was his strong desire for a family, and his determination in creating that. And I think, again, I have 4 children. I have taken for granted as a gay man in America. I've taken for granted the ability, certainly in the last 20 years, to start to create the family that I wanted to have. And I think for me, it was incredibly surprising when I found out about Kate Harrington, who is essentially his adopted daughter, who he brought in, and she started living with him from the age of 13. And I was struck by that passion. And I think even beyond that, the most surprising thing was probably, I always thought of Capote as this, as many people do, as this kind of bitchy queen, very clever, but kind of nasty. He wrote a mean thing about his friends. Should he have done it? Da, da, da. And one of the things that I really look at, and I think is, and it changed the way I viewed making the film was that he had he gave her so much love, and she really does consider him her father. I mean, he gave her so much love and attention and affection and really guided her. And I thought to myself, anyone who has that much to give, and whether you give it to your child, whether that be a biological child or a child that you mentor or what, however the case, whatever the situation is, I thought we have to be. The world has not gone to the next layer to understand who this person was, and I think that his desire to create that little family bubble and he adored her, and she is, and then you meet her and she is just the most divine, amazing, smart, thoughtful person you can imagine. And that opened my eyes to an entirely different angle of who Truman was.
I think that's that in and of itself is a surprising answer to me, and I love hearing you speak about it. I wanted to ask you about Kate. What it was like first meeting her. I mean, I always think one of the largest, most crucial strengths of a documentarian is access and gaining trust. And I imagine that relationship with her was very important in order for her to tell her story in the honest, forthright way she does. So I'm curious, what was it like meeting her? What was it like working with her and hearing her interpretations of the man firsthand?
It was wonderful. I mean, she's great. She's become a very good friend. She wanted to be, I think it was, look, I think enough time had lapsed that she was open to revisiting this, a lot of this. But, she also, like any daughter, close friend, was very adamant that she kept saying, I just want you to tell the full story. I know, she kept saying to me, I know you have to tell the decline. I know you have to talk about this decline. She said, but I just want you to just try and tell the full story. Try and tell the good stuff as well. And so it was wonderful. And she was open, and we finally met when she was living in Wyoming. And so we went out kind of to Sheridan, Wyoming, and spent a few days. And then she's a person now that I mean, I probably talk to at least every month, a couple times a month. But no, it's been a wonderful relationship. And I have to say that also of Alan Schwartz, who was Truman's attorney and is the kind of executor of the Capote Literary Trust. And Alan was another person who, you spend all this time searching and searching and searching and trying to get to someone, and then you get to them, and you just pray they don't slam the door in your face immediately. And he was, quite guarded, very much concerned about what was this going to be about his friend. And then he saw the film, we screened it for he and his wife privately, and he said, you got him. And that was, for me, the biggest, I was like, somewhere between, oh, thank God I didn't get it completely wrong, and, thank you.
Oh, that's wonderful. I think I've got time for just a couple more questions here. And before we go, I just wanted to turn back to answered prayers a little bit, because I do think it's not only a fascinating text, what we read of it. It's actually an interesting template, I think, for the way that we have come to view high society, and sort of from the perspective of that type of narrator. Feel free to not answer this question and just take it in any direction you want. But I find myself wondering what Truman Capote would have thought about the Real Housewives of New York. Like what would he thought? What would he be thinking about with reality TV, right? Do you have any perspective on that? It's fine if you don't, but I find myself returning to that question.
It's so funny you ask. I think Truman would have really, I don't think he would have cared for the Real Housewives. I think that would have been, he would have seen that as kind of, what he loved and what Answered Prayers is wonderful at. It's pulling back the curtain on people who don't want the curtain pulled back. And I think he would have kind of said, ugh, anybody who wants to be in front of the camera is already like, I'm not interested. That said, I've thought about this a lot. I think he would have been a prolific Instagrammer I think he would have been an exceptional tweeter because I think he would have had something to say about everything going on, about everyone. He would have been, he would have had a tweet back to this one or that. So I think in that sense, he certainly, and look, I think where your question is somewhat anchored, which is I agree with 100%, is that I do believe answered prayers and this style of writing was in many ways the precursor to, you know to a lot of the what we have currently. And I do think even the Real Housewives and the Kardashians, and there's it does certainly all link back. And I think Truman would have had a lot of fun, you know playing with everybody on different social media platforms.
I think Twitter is really built for someone like Truman Capote with your character limit. Therefore, brevity is the soul of wit, and he's got both, right? Exactly.
100%.
Oh man, I really could talk about Capote with you all day. I'm disappointed that we have to keep this to a reasonable length for our audience here. But I just have one more question for you, which is more a question about you than Capote. You have a really fascinating career yourself. I mean, you've sort of toggled between the public and private sectors. You worked for First Lady Michelle Obama as her policy director, and you worked in the White House as well. And now you find yourself as a first-time filmmaker on the festival circuits, receiving a lot of great reviews and a lot of love on your wonderful film. What is next for you? Are you going to make another movie? Are you focused on something else, or what has this journey been like for you?
Oh gosh, it's been an amazing journey. COVID notwithstanding, but we fight through that. Um, yes, I definitely have. I think one of the similarities between politics and filmmaking is that really, at its core, you're telling a story. You're storytellers, and we hope that in politics we can tell the story, thread the needle, and then be able to actually get into office and do good work that translates and actually helps people eat and put food on the table and send their children to school and feel healthy and safe. I think for me, the medium of filmmaking has been an amazing experience of storytelling, and in a different way, hopefully, certainly with this story, hopefully being able to go into, in essence, the graveyard and excavate a life and give it re-examination, and hopefully allow all of us today, because we can all learn so much from the past, to learn a little something new about maybe something we're going through or maybe something we're facing, and you learn, oh my god, Truman experienced that, or oh my god, that I can relate to it in this way. So I've loved the experience. I'm working on another two projects right now that I can't talk about yet, but I'm hopeful about and feeling good about. And so yeah, I love this medium, and so I'm hoping that I can do a bit more.
Well, I hope so too. I love the film so much, and it's been a real pleasure speaking with you. I just want to thank Eves Burno one more time for joining us at this Q&A, and thank you so much for allowing our audience to watch the Capote tapes. I know that they enjoyed the enthralling experience as much as I have.
Well,
And
thank you all. Thank
oh,
you, Daniel.
absolutely, thank you so much, and can't wait to see what's next.
Great. It's good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Bye bye.